Hi there. So chapter 3, section 3 starts to talk about centralization and decentralization, and these are really key concepts for a business to consider. And if you were going to look at, say, 10 different businesses in real life, you'd be able to really identify how much centralization was present in each one, and kind of what impact that has on the business itself. So we start off here with what we mean by centralization. So a centralized organization we're going to deem as one which decision-making authority is concentrated in one place, and that place will be the strategic apex, which we've seen already when we were looking at the work of Mintzberg earlier in the course. Now, you may have heard this term centralization used before when considering how geographically spread a business is, and absolutely we can use it for that. However, for the business and finance course, we're going to focus on this kind of idea of authority. So we're going to deem centralization or use centralization to discuss how centralized authority and decision making is. So underneath there, we've got a few factors that might consider how centralized or decentralized a business can actually be. So there are certain characteristics of a business that will make it easier or to centralize or to decentralize, or something that kind of lends itself to one of those. So for example, we've got here what kind of leadership style your management have. If you had a very authoritative leadership style, that probably then lends itself to a more centralized system. Whereas if you had a leadership style that was more participative, you might then expect people to kind of delegate more work outwards. The size of the organization, for example. So if you've got a very small business, then there doesn't tend to be much requirement to decentralize, to delegate some of that decision making outwards. However, if you've got a rather big business, you'd expect to see again more kind of decentralization this time. Okay, we'll just pick up a couple more here. So as we mentioned already, geography, but this time we're thinking about the impact of how geographically spread a business is on its decision-making authority in terms of centralization. So again, if you've got a rather spread geography, so if you've got strategic business units in lots of different locations, it's normally a good idea to try and delegate some authority and decision making outwards. So again, we're going to be ending up with a relatively decentralized organization in this sense. We've got a few more then as well. So technological advancement, obviously if technology is good, it makes it easier to kind of give local managers a bit more decision making power. Again, effectiveness of communication as well, so the more effective your communication is, the easier it is to delegate. So a few there for us to have a think about. Just underneath there then in 3.3 we've got a table that considers which one's best. Now, as with everything that we're going to see, it's not as easy as saying which one's best. There's always going to be a few advantages and disadvantages of each, and actually for what's best for one business won't always be what's best for both. So again, we'll have a look at a couple of these. So let's start off with the pro-centralization. So remember, pro-centralization, centralization is where we have more decision and more authority at head office, for example, and we don't tend to delegate and kind of pass authority down. So what's good about that? Well, if you're making decisions just in one place, it makes it much easier in terms of, well, I only have one person making decisions. I don't have to worry about how that impacts on somebody else's decisions further down. Also, you tend to find that people at head office, for example, will have a better idea of the overall kind of wider perspective on the business's objectives, for example. If we kind of drop down a couple there, we can follow on from that, and because they have this wider perspective, and also because we're thinking of the overall business's objectives whenever we're making any decision, it's more likely to produce what we call a congruent decision. So the decision that's in line with the overall business's objectives. What's good about decentralization then? So trying to spread some of that authority out, some of those decision-making tasks kind of down the chain. Definitely good for motivation. So if you've got a junior manager in a location somewhere, and you're allowing them to make decisions for the business, that's always going to be much better in terms of motivation. And whilst we said that centralization was good for a kind of wider perspective, you generally can't beat the kind of local knowledge that people on site have. So, you know, if you've got a special knowledge of the local area, that's going to be very useful in terms of making decisions for the business. Okay, so following on from that idea of delegation, over the page then we've got some tall or flat businesses, so another way to differentiate between two different business types. So when we're talking about tall and flat businesses, what we're really referring to is the number of levels within the business. So if I've got a tall business, it means that we're going to have lots of levels in terms of management, lots of kind of very traditional hierarchical levels, whereas a flat business will have less levels, so you know, wider responsibility for each level then. Before we go on to that though, we're just going to talk about span of control. So we define the span of control of a business as the number of people reporting into one person. So a wide span of control will have lots of people reporting into one person, and a narrow span of control will have relatively few people reporting into one person. Ulrich had a few theories around this area. First of all, kind of generally said that there does need to be tight managerial control. He's a classical theorist, so very traditional in terms of authority and decision making. However, to enable us to have that kind of tight control, we normally need to limit ourselves to between 3 and 6 subordinates per manager. So you don't want lots of people kind of reporting into you, because it might take up too much time for kind of routine problems, so squabbles and disagreements among your team. At the same time, if you have too few people reporting into each manager, they might end up not delegating. So what's the point in delegating if actually you haven't really got that much work to do? So you don't have to worry too much about squabbles. You've got one person below you, you might think, well, I might as well just do that task myself. As I said, then underneath we've got a couple of definitions here of tall and flat businesses. We start off by considering the scalar chain. So the scalar chain is essentially the height of the business. So it's the chain of command from the most senior to the most junior. And we can see underneath in our diagrams here of a tall business and a flat business, this really is going to be a good indicator of what type of business we have, whether it's tall or flat. So we define a tall business then as one that has relatively a large number of levels. So you can see with our tall business diagram on the left here, you've got team leaders and supervisors and assistant managers, and then section managers, department managers, so lots of levels of management. Over on the right hand side then we've got our flat business, which we define as one that has a relatively small number of hierarchical levels. Now this obviously has a massive impact on the span of control. So if we have lots of levels and therefore lots of management, each manager tends to have a relatively narrow span of control, so relatively few subordinates reporting into them. If you take away some of those levels of management, then you end up with a wider span of control, so each person has to manage a bit more. Now again, unfortunately, it's not a case of one of these types is better than the other. It really depends on your business. So we've got a few pros and cons here. So this one for tall businesses, let's have a look at a couple of these. So first of all, we know that it's important to keep that control span relatively small. We don't want lots and lots and lots of people reporting into a manager, so we're avoiding those kind of squabbles and disagreements. Also, if I've got relatively few, it enables me to get my workforce participating in kind of perhaps even in decision making, so get them more involved in more things. Against then, well, like we said, if we have relatively few, it might inhibit delegation, and because we have this kind of lots and lots of levels of management, you end up with quite slow decision making. If every decision has to go through several layers, it tends to be quite tedious in terms of making a decision. Underneath there then we've got the pros and cons for a flat business, so one with relatively few levels. Definitely more opportunity for delegation here, and that's mainly because the management has lots of kind of admin bits and pieces to do, so it has to delegate. and also relatively cheap. So obviously management are quite expensive, so the less of them you have, the cheaper that's going to be. Against then, well, if you've got a flat business, so a relatively wide span of control, but you have a job where tasks can't really be delegated, so the tasks themselves, are not something that can be delegated, then that can cause an issue. And also, if you're considering getting rid of some levels of management, you might find that actually you're lacking people that turn an idea into action. So you need to make sure that you've got the correct level of middle managers to take your overall strategy and put it into a more day-to-day approach. Okay, lastly in this section then, we're going to move on to mechanistic and organic structures. Now we often call mechanistic structures a bureaucracy, and that's because a mechanistic structure is one where it's quite stable and slow and efficient, and it's, for example, going to be an existing established business. So a well-established business is often not going to be required to make rapid changes. It's not necessarily going to be reacting to quick changing market conditions, because it's well established, it's been around for a while, it knows what it's doing and kind of what its market is. So we'd call that a mechanistic business, and sometimes we call that a bureaucracy. An organic business then is more flexible. So this might be for a startup or for a new business. Often we think about tech companies having to be organic, in that they're having to respond very quickly to changing consumer taste, to competitive behavior and different market conditions. So you can imagine one big established business, one kind of new and growing business. That's how we're going to split kind of mechanistic and organic businesses out. And for the BF exam, then all you really need to be able to do is to consider some of the characteristics of each, which we're going to go through, and then also consider some of the pros and cons, and just be able to kind of pick those from a list. So it shouldn't be too tricky for the real exam. Okay, so we've got a definition here of bureaucracy. So a continuous organisation of official functions bound by rules. And all we've done underneath there is then we've split out that definition to consider exactly what that means. It's very easy to see these definitions and then not really kind of dive into exactly what we're referring to. So first of all, what do we mean by a continuous organisation? Well, it's not a case of the people are the business. We have people in different roles. When people leave, new people come and fill in. So if I've got a finance director, that person leaves, the company doesn't go kaput, we just get somebody else in to do that job for us. Official functions, so everyone has a role, everyone has specified duties, and everyone has the correct amount of authority to carry out the duties that they're required to do. And then finally we've got rules, so making sure we have a set of procedures, a set of policies that says what we need to do in certain scenarios. So that's the definition of a bureaucracy, so very rule based. And we've got a few characteristics here, so again we'll run through a few of these. Firstly, we've got the reference to the hierarchy, so everybody knows where they fit, so every lower office is under the control of a higher one. Because we've got this idea of official functions, it means that everybody has a specialization. So if I'm the finance director, I'd expect to be specializing in finance. A bit further down then, again, this idea of kind of very impersonal, so we have impersonal rules, and they act according to those impersonal procedures, so the procedures are based around the organisation and the role rather than the individual. And again, a bit further down still, we've got procedures that make sure that whoever's doing the task, those tasks are carried out in the same way. So whoever's filling in an employee expense claim, that expense claim is filled in the same way. Whoever's setting up a new supplier, that supplier is set up in the same way. So very rigid, very controlled. That obviously brings lots of advantages and a few disadvantages too, so let's have a look at these. So it is good if you've got something that you tend to do over and over and over. So a big business will do the same task over and over and over every period. Can be really efficient, so if I've not got a very changing environment, then absolutely having one best way of doing things tends to make things very efficient. Disadvantages though, as we've said, slow decision making. So I don't necessarily want lots of procedures and lots of one best way of doing things when I'm trying to react quickly to a change. So it can slow things down quite a lot. And at the same time, we would worry about innovation. So when you've got a strict rule to follow, you're then worried a bit more about your kind of creativity, I guess. So following on from that, we've got a few characteristics this time of an organic organisation. So much more flexible, much more flowing. So starting off with status. So although we don't have a traditional hierarchy, there is still a status within the organisation. It's normally driven by how much experience each person has. So if you're good at a certain task, you tend to have a status of authority there. Commitment, so everyone still pulls together for the goals of the business, so it's not as if everyone's going out on their own tasks. Everyone's still trying to be organic, but just in the sense of aiming for the same goal. And again, rather than having this, you must do this, you report into this person, we rely on shared beliefs. So the culture becomes really important, and how we see other people behaving gives us a really good guidance as to how we should behave. So really important that you have a good look over those different characteristics. Make sure that you're able to pick each characteristic out from a question, and then you may even be asked to kind of pull out some of those pros and cons. That's all for this recording. Up next, then we're going to have a look at the different types of business that we can have, so a sole tradership and so on.